Today's community planning conversation is with Emily Talen. Emily is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the university. Welcome, Emily, and thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Patsy.
I'd like to start out with asking you to talk to us about your educational background and how this led you into urban planning.
Oh, okay. Well, I have an undergrad degree in sociology from a small liberal arts school. Then I spent some time in Paris and got really interested in the planning of Paris when I was a senior in college. And really, right off the bat, wanted to be an urban planner after that brush up with that incredible city of Paris and what the tremendous planning they did in the 19th century. And so then in my early 20s, I got a master's degree in urban planning and worked as a planner for a number of years, for about 6 years in local governments. And then decided I wanted to have an academic career and went on to get a PhD at the University of California in urban geography. So that kind of allowed me to bridge several different disciplines and bring them together in the field of planning.
And what was the key thing you took away from that year in Paris? How that city is planned that you see yourself using today?
Well, I think I was just so awed, but I grew up in the suburbs, in the worst kind of urban environments, and I think going over there to Europe, that was my first experience being in Europe. I just was amazed at how great cities could be and how incredibly important the design of space was, and paying attention to the as we call it, the outdoor room that's created by buildings. And it just really transformed my outlook about what I wanted to do with my life and how I looked at the environment. And I just was so overcome with the idea, why can't American cities look like Paris? Why can't we do better with our cities? And so for the past 25 years, I've been asking myself that question, and I keep working at it, because there are a lot of things we could do.
And you have a very strong interest in urban design. Is this how you got to that interest?
Yeah, it's I just see the power of design to accomplish a lot of things. And when I first got into planning, when I was in planning school 20 years ago, actually design wasn't that. It was kind of the conventional look at urban planning, very two-dimensional, very much about figuring out. I remember a site planning course, and it was all about figuring out, where does the residential go, and where does the single family go, and where's the commercial go, and it was all about looking at the world in this two-dimensional kind of way and really segregating everything about urban life, rather than looking at context, looking at the third dimension, looking at that Parisian kind of experience of cities. And so I think after that, I moved to Santa Barbara, which is where I got my degree and where I worked as a planner. And living in that was also a very beautiful, kind of inspiring environment that nurtures the spirit. And I think that I became more and more convinced that design was such an important part of planning that was often kind of missing from it. And that was kind of growing on me, and it wasn't until after I did all my dissertation work, which was not that much about design, that I really became more focused on the design aspects.
Well, you just mentioned Santa Barbara as a good example. Are there a couple of other cities in the United States that you would send us off to as good
There's
examples?
a couple.
just in case we can't get to Paris.
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, a lot of the older cities. Annapolis is one that's often mentioned. Washington, D.C., certainly Chicago has wonderful neighborhoods. Parts of Champaign-Urbana are wonderful. It's where you can find that fabric that makes you feel good and that is a pleasant kind of environment, and where you actually want to get out of your car and walk around. Those are the kinds of environments that exist in any city. Some cities have a lot more of that kind of fabric than others do.
So you're suggesting that maybe what makes you feel good would be different than maybe what makes me feel good while I'm walking around a city, or are you saying that there is a commonality there?
Well, I think you have to allow for different people's perceptions of the environment, but I do think it's not all hopelessly relative. I think that there are commonalities, and I think that that's such a good point that you bring that up, because if it's all going to be completely, oh well, it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder and it's just whatever people think. Some people love a Walmart parking lot. You know, if you're going to approach the planning of cities with that kind of mindset, then you might as well give up on planning and in the public realm. You know, it's I think there are certain assumptions that have to be made about what is a good functioning nurturing of the human spirit kind of environment and what isn't.
So do you ever give your students the assignment to go out and walk around and then write a short essay on what made them feel good or what didn't make them feel good in the area?
Yeah, yeah, and they love to do that. I often, well, a couple of times, I have had groups of students go out, find environments that you like, that feel good, and then try to articulate why it is you like those places. And when you do that, you do find a lot of commonalities. I mean, nobody, if they're really honest, goes to a parking lot and says, "This is a great space, I love this." I mean, you could look at that parking lot very analytically and try to derive something from it in a really abstract kind of postmodern kind of way. But if people are really being true to themselves, I think that there are a lot of commonalities.
And in these commonalities, I noticed that you brought to share with us today information about new urbanism. I'm sure our audience is aware of those terms, but maybe they don't have a full appreciation of exactly what new urbanism is. Could you talk to us about that?
Well, some of these commonalities I've been mentioning, a lot of people feel this way, and that there are certain principles about the way human settlement ought to be that Americans have been terrible at, and Europeans were much better at. A lot of other cultures are much better at, but Americans, with their focus on the supremacy of the private property, the supremacy of the automobile, their kind of selfish way of looking at a settlement. That there was a reaction, a very strong reaction to all of that in the about 20 years ago, and a lot of people came together. Started with a small group of architects, but now it's a much bigger group, came together to form this organization called Congress for the New Urbanism. And it's, in being an academic, it's a little embarrassing to be the member of a club like the Congress for the New Urbanism, because it's too clubby. But nevertheless, it has this statement of 27 different principles that are really very hard to argue with, I think. They're divided into, and they're just basic ideas about how cities ought to be formed, how they ought to function, what they ought to look like. I'll give you some examples, some of the key principles. Here's a really key one that's talked about a lot. You can see that on the, I gotta figure out how to make this straight. How's that? Zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, do you want to bring there? That's good.
And this is the idea of contrasting environments where the pedestrian matters versus environments that are oriented exclusively to the automobile. And
are you referring to out in these areas here?
Yeah. So these are two different. We're contrasting this section with this section up here. Down here, to get from any one point to the shopping area or to the school is a much easier task. Up here, which is known as the dendritic street system, which is the way suburban areas and sprawling areas are often planned, to get from the house at the end of this cul-de-sac here, you have to go down here and around here and back out here and over to the school. Same thing with getting to these segregated commercial areas. So this is just explaining the principle of trying to have an urban environment that's more connected, that has better connectivity.
It cuts up the land a great deal
Yeah.
also, besides the
Yeah.
connectivity issue.
That's right. And there are a lot of other principles. As I said, there's 27 of them
Here, do you want to?
in this.
Yeah, there you
How's
go.
that?
Yeah.
Yeah, here's another example just showing this idea of wanting to create streets. And of course, streets are the largest public space in any city. They take up the most land area, so streets are really important to deal with. But the idea of treating streets in a much more humane way, in a more enclosed kind of way, and taking care of them so that they can function appropriately as public space. And that's another way of connecting people. This is, up here is a kind of environment where you wouldn't really be too excited about walking in. Put some street trees, get the buildings closer to the street, put in an arcade, and you have a much more humane kind of environment. So a lot of the principles in here are really I don't think a lot of people actually disagree with a lot of the principles in here. There is some objection to putting them in the form of a charter that people sign on to, and it's very, what we call, this is very normative planning, what ought to be. And planning has, as you know, has kind of evolved since the 60s as something that's all about whatever the public wants. We just throw it out there to the public, and we shouldn't be forcing any principles at them. So that's a bit of a controversy. That's one aspect of the controversy. Another very problematic thing, I'll just be honest, about this charter is that the principles sound good, but in reality, in getting them implemented, that's a whole other matter. And that's something that I spent a lot of time talking to my new urbanist colleagues about on various listservs and at conferences and things. What are the mechanisms and the policy tools that are needed to accomplish all these wonderful goals? Some of the goals are really quite progressive and very much about social justice. Patsy, you would like them. They're about equity, about, making sure that you have a human environment that includes everybody, that doesn't segregate according to housing type, that provides the civic spaces, public spaces that can connect people. And of course, what's been happening with new urbanism is the minute we build one of these nice new urbanist communities with the mix of housing types, they get priced right out of the market, and even the tiny little above the store apartment that was supposed to be affordable and create all this diversity is no longer affordable. So what needs to happen is much more of a focus on the policy aspects, I think, of implementation of these principles, and that's been a real kind of sticking point because so many of the people involved with this movement are architects, and they really want to focus on the design issues. They're very annoyed with having to, think about dealing with housing policy and all kinds of other things that are an essential part of making these principles happen.
So you have some ideas on how this might be put into policy to accomplish what you're talking about. What are some of those ideas?
Well, let's just talk about housing. There are a whole raft of policies, ways of involving nonprofits, community development corporations, subsidies and tax breaks, and all kinds of, the list is quite long of different tools that housing advocates have proposed. What I think needs to happen in the creation of these diverse communities is that we design, on the one hand, we design it right, so that it is paying attention to design, and it is including the right ingredients, the sort of infrastructure that needs to be there. But at the same time, we suggest and be activists for making sure that some of these policies actually get implemented, that the developer who plans and develops a new urbanist community is required to have, to allow for a certain percentage of affordable housing, for example, or workforce housing is the big buzzword now.
Right.
So even that step would be a lot. As it happens right now, new urbanism is taking place mostly, I'd say the vast majority of developments are just private sector. There's no sort of public-private partnership.
That
there-
intersection hasn't happened yet.
Right. Well, it happened for a little bit with the Hope 6 developments that were government-funded mixed-income communities along new urbanist principles. Those were working really nicely until the most recent Republican Congress decided to yank all the funding, which was really very unfortunate.
But then, but if I'm fortunate enough and I'm able to buy one of these that has been built at a lower cost because it's had some grant subsidy or wherever the funding has come, what can be done to prevent me from making a huge profit when I go to sell it, and so it loses that accessibility for workforce housing or lower income housing, whichever terminology one chooses to use?
Well, there are different strategies. I mean, there are caps that can be placed on a property so that, that's the trade-off. Do you want people to be able to reap all the rewards of buying into a community, a new urbanist community that's going to really appreciate and value? Or do you want to put in some mechanisms so that it maintains its economic diversity? And that's the trade-off that has to be made. In Chicago, different groups do all sorts of things. I mean, there's land trusts, for example, which are really getting more popular.
Why don't you explain to land trust?
And a land trust is an arrangement with a nonprofit organization that buys land and, develops affordable housing. It can be in agreement with a local government, and agrees to, through their financial abilities of, maintaining that land, they are able to, in perpetuity, offer that affordable housing and have it stay that way. So it's just another way of ensuring that affordability for a long time.
Do we have any locally that are functioning in that way?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. A community land trust. They've been around a long time. There was
Right.
just a recent article in planning about in Chicago that they're kind of taking
Right,
off.
and I know of a number in Atlanta, but I was wondering if we had any that we could use as examples locally. But you're not aware of any. Okay.
Oh, I'm not aware of any. And then, in Chicago, all the other thing that they do is a planner up there was just explaining to me how it works. They'll have a new development proposed for a neighborhood in Chicago, and as you know, there's a lot of problems with gentrification and maintaining housing values. So they will negotiate with the developer and say, okay, you have to keep 15% of the units you're adding have to be affordable. And they actually work it out with the developer what that level would be. It's sort of a case-by-case basis, which I thought was interesting, based on their pro forma, based on their ability to, they want to make sure the project will work, that the numbers will work. So they have a financial person who's very involved in the planning process, who sits down with the developer, they propose everything, and then it's up to the developer to maintain that affordability level over time. It sticks with the property. And they actually have an enforcement person.
Almost like a covenant, which is going to run with the property then.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then they have an enforcement staff that follows up every couple of years and makes sure that these developments really are still affordable to 15% of the population.
So a second and third generation buyer, in other words, can still come into the situation, and maybe the first generation buyer made a 10% profit on selling the house, but not 30 or 40%, which might have been market rate at that time of selling.
Right.
Okay.
And they might need to, it might be a rental situation where they just need to maintain rents that are affordable.
You're working up in Chicago a great deal lately with your students. What are some of those projects that you've been focusing on?
Well, I've been really, first of all, it's hard to be an urban planner here and not feel the incredible pull of Chicago. It is a premier city, and I just feel it's in need. It has so much material for an urban planner to sink their teeth into. So I've been going up, very regularly and focusing on Chicago's diverse neighborhoods. And I've been working on this for about almost 2 years now. And I started out just looking at all the data for all of Cook County, actually, and just figuring out, okay, what are the places in Chicago that are really diverse
Now,
in a
why don't
small
you
area?
define diverse so
Okay,
people know what you're
people
looking
define
at?
it in many different ways,
Right.
but what I use 4 criteria:
Okay.
economic, racial and ethnic, family type, and age.
Mhm.
And so, just looking at census data, I looked at areas that were. I tried to find area. I've been analyzing. Where are the areas that have a lot of age diversity? Like you've got young and old and middle and everything, and it's all living in a relatively small area. And what does that age diverse area look like? How does it function? So that's one question. So I've looked at all these different dimensions separately. And now I'm in a phase where I've combined all the variables and looked at what's sort of the cream of the crop with diversity, diverse in all 4 dimensions, and over time, able to maintain it over
Okay.
time,
Mhm.
10 years. So going through this sort of weeding out process, I narrowed it down to 6 areas in Chicago that met all that criteria.
And what are those areas?
And they are, I wish I brought a map with me, Portage Park and Irving Park, which are it's northwest, but still the city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
West Rogers Park, some people might be familiar with that area. It's Devon Avenue, which is world famous Pakistani Indian commercial corridor, a very interesting place. Because the people who run the commercial businesses there don't live in that neighborhood, I found out, which is
They
really
commute
strange.
in.
They commute in.
Okay.
And then, so those are in Chicago, and then Bridgeport, which is the home of Mayor Daley and, the
Not
White
anymore.
Sox.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, right. He moved out.
Yes.
But
he did.
that is a place that, is also met all my criteria. And then, so those are in the city of Chicago, and then I have 2 that are just outside the borders of Chicago. Berwyn, which is the Bungalow Belt. Some people might know it as that. And Blue Island, which is 1/3 Asian, 1/3 black. 1/3 white, 1/3 black, 1/3 Hispanic. Almost exactly. So, so the next thing I did was I got some grant money, which was wonderful, and I hired 6 students who live in Chicago. These are not UIUC students. I have 2 from University of Chicago, 2 from UIC, and 2 from Loyola. And I assigned each student to one of these 6 areas, and they are interviewing people and doing 15 interviews each. So, and I've done a lot of interviews. So I'll have over 100 hour-long, in-depth interviews with people, mostly stakeholders and people who are involved with organizations and things rather than guy off the street kind of
And they're asking what kind of questions?
And they're asking, what is it? What's your awareness of the diversity in this area? Does that affect you at all? How is that dealt with? Are there tensions involved? And mostly, what I'm very interested in is how does the environment here? What does it have to do with that diversity? What are the ways? Since of my interest in design, what are the ways in which the physical environment supports or nurtures or doesn't support that social diversity? For example, does everybody use the commercial area? Because the theory is that a diversity of people requires a diversity of business. So you can't really have one without the other. Now, if those mom and pop shops, that diversity is failing, what kind of stress does that put on the diversity around? How community facilities function, how the parks function, how the various public spaces function. In the schools, what are the kinds of tensions that happen? And we've really had no difficulty getting all kinds of interesting ideas and feedback about this issue. People living in these neighborhoods are very aware of the diversity around them, they don't necessarily connect that to the physical environment, but that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to find out those connections. Not that the physical environment determines diversity or even vice versa, but just that there is some kind of relationship there.
Has anybody said to you, I came here because I knew it was so diverse? I was seeking that.
Yeah, I don't know about actually moving there for that reason, but a lot of people are I would say the majority are proud of the diversity and want to see it work and are, kind of advocates for that diversity.
And you said your students are talking mostly to leaders or stakeholders in these areas. What about the John Q. public? Are they chatting with
see, that's
those?
just a little hard to connect to, but they are getting people in, like small business owners, people who head up a local art gallery, ministers, rabbis, people who, there is, I think I am kind of missing out on the John Q. public, but I also want to get the most bang for my buck. There's just 15 interviews per area, so I want people who who've thought about the area and, have some insights about it.
Do we have any place like that here in Champaign-Urbana, a neighborhood that, I know it isn't the metropolis that you are drawn to, but do we have any neighborhoods that might meet those criteria?
Well, that's a good question. I looked at the data for Champaign-Urbana. That's how I started with this. And because I always thought that I lived in a very diverse neighborhood, which is the West Urbana neighborhood. And it turns out, relative to the whole region, it's not that diverse because it depends on how the students are counted. In the census, they don't really count. But really the most diversity I found was in Champaign, in downtown Champaign and just north of downtown Champaign. So kind of in that area between downtown
And the highway.
And the highway.
Okay.
That was the area that had quite a bit of, especially racial diversity.
And have you and your students done any work up in that area as a sort of a pre to the work you started doing up in Chicago?
No, I mean, I mapped it all out, but I never really pursued it. I wanted to go to the big city.
Understandable. Now, this work that you're doing up in Chicago, is this what you're using for the book that you're currently working on?
Yes. This is the basis of the book. Will be a runaway bestseller.
A runaway bestseller on 6 Chicago neighborhoods.
Yes.
To be looked for in your nearest
At least
Borders
everyone
bookstore.
in those neighborhoods ought to be buying it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also an exhibition that's going to run for the month of June in iSpace Gallery.
And it'll be what kind of exhibition?
It is, well, it's a lot of the material I've been generating in the form of the analysis, which is maps and a lot of imagery, and I'll have some quotes from some of the interviewing, and then some of the planning and design recommendations I've been doing with the need to promote a physical infrastructure that is more supportive of diversity. Some of the kinds of things I already mentioned about strengthening the public realm and finding these sort of connecting points in the neighborhood that are places people can walk to, and that might, because I think it's really important to, this is what is starting to emerge from my research in this, is that these diverse neighborhoods, we need to go out of our way to help them be sustainable, to sustain them as diverse places, because what's happening to them, especially in Bridgeport and West Rogers Park, less so, but Bridgeport is a really good example of a lot of new condo development coming in. And the people who come in are disconnected generally from the existing population. And there was a wonderful study that just came out by Phil Neiden, who's up at Loyola University. He was hired by the Chicago Housing Authority to look at stressed, gentrifying neighborhoods and interview people and talk to them about what what's happening here? He's a sociologist. So really trying to get into what are the problems with gentrification and displacement. And I read through that, and it was really helped me a lot understand the tensions involved and how the old timers feel that the new people coming in don't care about the neighborhood and are just driving into their condo, parking the car, and going up. And so there's this kind of lack of connection and a lot of fear. And I think that, and of course, one thing that's happening is that housing prices, people get displaced. And so there's a need, I think, for planners to pay attention to the needs of these places more forthrightly. And I think that design of the environment is something that is not really taken into account.
It's not
as much as it
conducive
could
to
be.
making connections. If people have been up in those areas and look at the layout of those new places.
Right, well, exactly. Yeah, that's what I've been finding.
Right, and isn't Bridgeport the area where Mayor Daley had a lot of places raised, so there was a lot of open land for the development of these new condos that have gone into that area. So there may have been some underlying friction already built in because of his movement to clean out the area by leveling so many buildings. In your, you open up two avenues here. First one, I'd like to go back a little bit to the picture that you had on relationship of design and walkability and connectivity, and how through design it encourages people to want to walk rather than get into their car. And I kind of want to connect that to Todd Littman is coming into town next week, and he's a transportation expert that's being brought in by our local mass transit. So it's certainly a topic that is on our minds here in this community, and you're focusing on it. So have you found some specific concepts or ideas that you can share with us that we should be thinking about in how we develop this connectivity?
Well, there's a lot of wonderful ideas about that. If I had to kind of summarize the main ones, it's really important to think about the pathways between a destination and where people are living. A lot of times planners will just look at the distances,
between A and B.
Between A and B. And you really need to, this is where design comes in, you need to make sure that the walking from point A to B is a pleasurable experience. And if there are parking lots to go by and busy roads to cross and all of that, you need to map that out and think about how to make that a better walking experience. The other huge area, of course, is traffic calming. And there are all kinds of great ways to...
What does it, first, why don't you tell people what that means, traffic calming?
Well, we've allowed many of our streets and roads in urban environments and in our neighborhoods to become traffic sewers, as Jim Kunstler would call them, creating an automobile slum. But it's this idea that the car has priority over everyone else, and this is a huge issue here, and I'm really happy with the steps I've been seeing with calming down Lincoln Avenue and other places. But anyway, the idea is to shift the priorities and make sure that pedestrians have an equal hold, or if not greater, than the automobile. So when you shift that priority and you really look at your connections and your infrastructure from the mindset of a pedestrian, that means that a lot of these streets are obviously very hostile environments. Traffic is moving too quickly. It's no longer acceptable to think just in terms of flow, just maximizing flow on the streets. No, it's about making sure that it's a multimodal street that can accommodate bikes and people and walking and cars.
So children can play in streets again, or runners can use them for their running pathways. And
On some streets, sure.
not
Yeah.
on the main streets,
Not
but
on
on
Lincoln. But, so there are, there's a whole body of techniques out there to promote what's called traffic calming. And that it's often about narrowing the street, putting parking in on either side. That's a way of narrowing the street. Putting in median strips, putting in what's called a bump out at the intersection so that the pedestrian actually has a smaller distance to walk to cross the street. A roundabout is something that's a lot of cities are doing. So but you have to get people used to the idea that if they're going to travel through town, they're not going to do it really quickly. They have to just change their time clock when they go through the city. If they're looking to get from point A to point B really fast, they got to go somewhere else, not through this environment where we're trying to have a mix of different kinds of uses. So that's, I noticed that almost every day on Lincoln Avenue. When I cross there, getting from my neighborhood over to the university, people are anxious at that stop light or the stop sign.
Where Nevada tees in.
Where Nevada tees in, especially,
to Lincoln. So do you like some of the plans for the redesign of Lincoln between
I do.
Green and Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah. I'm just thrilled that something is happening there. I think they're absolutely on the right direction. And I went to the meeting, the sort of public input, and I was amazed whenever, I'm just amazed to hear people come to a meeting like that and say, well, you're going to slow me down by 1 minute, getting from Florida up to, 74. I might have to go slower, but I thought the planners were great in their response, and they said, it's no longer about making sure that you get there as fast as possible. You now have to take your turn and allow other modes of travel to have a right to the use of this street. And cars have, for so long, since World War II, had the idea that, or even before, had the idea that they rule the road, that their needs are supreme above all else, and that is really a mindset that's needs to change and is beginning to change. I have the conflict internally because when I'm in my car, I have that same idea. Get out of my way. I'm driving here.
But one of the key principles behind traffic calming is to design it so that the driver does feel that progress is being made, albeit slower progress, because we have learned that part of the aggressiveness behind the wheel on a car is when a driver feels that progress isn't being made, so there's that kind of psychological.
So as long as they're inching along
and feeling that they're getting their fair turn at making this progress. Besides Lincoln Avenue, with your ideas on connectivity, other places within the community to apply some of what you're learning up in Chicago, what you've learned from new urbanism, what are you can design the city as you wish.
Oh my.
What would you like to see some other ideas that would make ours a more livable community?
Yeah. I don't know, Patsy. I don't know if we're doing all we can to really infill rather than spill out at the borders.
Okay.
There's a lot of underutilized land within the confines of Champaign and Urbana. It isn't big parcels of land that a developer might want to come in and do all at once. But I don't want to critique either city. They have very good people working at this. But I think there's also a lot of pressure at the periphery to keep sprawling out, and there's just been a tremendous amount of sprawl in both in both directions, in all directions, which is why I never go out there. It's just way too depressing. I hate to see what's happening at the outskirts.
We need a growth corset.
We do. We need to
Around
constrain
both
things.
communities to sort of draw them in.
Yeah, or if there is going to be development out there, I mean, I'm not saying all the development can be accommodated in town, but the stuff I see, and that's even sort of trying to pass off as new urbanism, is not new urbanism. It's a laughable kind of pseudo, we call it faux new urbanism.
And so what is the differentials that you see that make it not fulfill these principles that you were talking about?
Well, it's not, it doesn't sustain an individual once they get out there.
So they
It
still have
doesn't.
to get in the car to go to a grocery store is what you're saying. Okay.
Exactly. It's just a slightly more compact
In
environment.
the placement of the housing.
And the placement of the housing. But,
But
there
not-
isn't a good diversity of housing type. There isn't a good diversity of uses. There isn't a commercial aspect that's integrated well with the neighborhood. There might be a Walmart next door, but you still have to get out and drive around. So it's really not fulfilling that need of creating a sustainable community. And that's very difficult to do in a small town. I would much rather see development patterns at the periphery be much more low density and, just not try to be this sort of compact pseudo-new urbanist form that ends up not helping anything in terms of the goals of creating a more sustainable environment.
I heard a very interesting talk by our state level historic preservation officer, sometimes affectionately called the SHPO. And he was talking about green construction and how historic preservationists have sort of rewrapped that concept in reuse of buildings as green construction because it is a matter of reuse. And the infill that you were just alluding to, he had a whole new set of data points showing how much energy it costs us in relationship to the driving, which is what you just were talking about, to get out to these fringes. And at the point he was giving the talk was just before the recent referendum for Unit 4, and he was talking about the chosen location for one of the new schools, which is out in the west area of Champaign beyond some of the highways, and he had calculated the cost of what it would be for families to be traversing out there to bring children in relationship to the cost of renovating older schools that are closer in. So it was another perspective on and supportive of the argument that you're making of looking at filling in first rather than going out to the fringes because there's open space. And he didn't, and I had a conversation with Brad Yukon, who is director of our local farm bureau, and he reminded us how important our farmland is here because we're one of 3 areas globally on good farmland, the other being Argentina and the Ukraine. So this land does have so much significance for us to be thinking about then covering it up as we're doing at about 5-fold to the population growth, which is, I think, what you're talking about. And
yeah, I'm glad you brought up about schools because that's the other reason to really, we talk a lot about wanting to build these sustainable communities like new urbanist communities are supposed to be because we want to reduce travel. But it's also about, automobile accessibility. But it's also about the creation of diverse places so that resources are shared more equitably. And schools is a really big, important example of that. You need to, this model of having wealthier kids out in the suburbs having these schools of one type and, you know, the poorer kids in
Mhm,
town
mhm.
of a different type of school with fewer resources, or just concentrated families that are lower income all going to the same school. That's a horrible model. Now, I know that the Champaign has done something about that, but it's my understanding that I don't know much about it, but correct me if I'm wrong, people are now basically in Champaign driving all over the place to get to a school that they want to go to. I mean, they can go to any school in Champaign or something, but
There is choice,
there's
yes.
choice, but they end up not going to their neighborhood school
Not necessarily, yes.
and going wherever. So it's really it's kind of a crazy world that way. I mean, it should be that there's a mix of people in one neighborhood, and that mix is sharing a resource.
Cynthia Hoyle joined me for one of these conversations at the time she was working on the Walkable School project, and during that conversation I brought up the first thing that I learned from Len Human, who was a colleague of ours and expert in housing, and that is the way you integrate schools and neighborhoods is to integrate housing, which is just what you're talking about from from an economic level, and then that mitigates all of this bus shifting around that Champaign, because of the court decision, is certainly involved with, and trying to keep a balance. Um, One of the things that I find very fascinating is what Madison, Wisconsin did when they were realizing an imbalance of what was happening to the value of property there, and actually it started with a realtor who realized that certain areas of Madison were getting overpriced because of the quality of the schools in that area, and that's where people wanted to settle. And this individual brought together a banker and people from the power company and the city planning and some people from the churches, etc., and brought them all together, and they sat down and discussed and figured out how do they create a more balanced community. And that was about 5 years ago. That article was in planning. And just recently, I heard that Madison now considers itself a much more balanced community from the perspective of the quality of their schools. And the fallout of that means that they're much more balanced in relationship to property values, and not this imbalance of having to bus students around. But we don't seem to have ever set up anything like that within this community of these different entities sitting down and trying to solve this planning.
That's a good idea.
That planning problem, or our school districts don't have hired planners on their staffs to be thinking of some of these issues of location and where schools and housing is beginning to be built, and causing more pressure on the schools being built out on the fringes of our communities.
And a big complaint is that the requirements for school building are just outrageous in terms of, you know, parking areas needed, and it has to be a one-story building, which just spreads everything out even more. And so, you know, that's another front that people have been working on, as you might know, is to try to do something about the regulations of school building. Why not renovate a school and, you know, loosen up the code requirements so that kids can go to multi-story schools and be more compact and be able to fit into a neighborhood that's got that mix of housing types. That, again, is a design issue.
That's a very good point to bring up, that has put some pressure on, especially the placement of new high schools, which end up on the fringe of the community, which then mean every student is probably coming in a car, which then we're back into the energy use and the real convolution. What have you seen up in the Chicago area in relationship to the school situation in these 6 neighborhoods that you're looking at? Do each of those areas have strong schools?
They have, the schools are a bit problematic. You know, as you know, Chicago schools are troubled. But there's such an incredible, like in Bridgeport, for example, the mix of, there are more private Catholic schools than public elementary schools.
Okay.
I mean, it's just an amazing,
Okay.
Chicago has this incredible network of private schools,
schools
that have really been carrying the load, I think. And the public schools, you know, did you hear the statistic that 6% of, if you graduate from a Chicago public high school, you have only 6% of those graduates go on to graduate from college.
So it is a very serious problem up there, and the quality of the education that these students are getting to prepare themselves to go on to college.
Yeah, apparently. I mean, I went to something sponsored by CNU, Congress for the New Urbanism, on schools a couple months ago in Chicago, and it was all about the head of the CNU, John Norquist, who's the former mayor of Milwaukee, is very into vouchers and really thinks that that will be the saving grace of cities if we can institute a voucher program. And he tried to make his case and brought in experts from all over the place. I wasn't completely convinced, but the idea is if you just release this fear people have, parents with kids, of, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go to Chicago Public Schools if I move into Chicago, release that fear, then you will get people moving in. They'll be able to go to whatever school they want. They'll be able to find the right school. And it will create more investment in urban places and more living downtown. So, of course, the drawback is what happened in neighborhood schools. You know,
right.
Those are kind of thrown out the window. So,
you've given me an excellent topic for the conversation next week, which is going to be with Scott Anderson, who's on the unit for school board. So I thank you for that.
Sure. Schools are huge issue.
Huge issue. Thank you for teaching us about new urbanism this afternoon. This is Patsy Petrie thanking Emily Talen for joining me on this issue of Community Planning Conversations.